You're listening to this podcast, so I know you've got a curious mind. Here's a helpful fact you might not know yet. Drivers who switch and save with Progressive save over $900 on average. They make it super simple. Pop over to Progressive.com, answer some questions, and you'll get a quick quote with coverage options tailored to your choices. Plus, you'll see which discounts you may qualify for, like the online quote discount or savings for paying in full. In fact, 99% of Progressive Auto customers earn at least one discount. See if you could save when you switch to Progressive. You'll feel good about making a savvy choice. Visit Progressive.com and see if you can enjoy a little extra cash back. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. National average 12-month savings of $946 by new customers surveyed who saved with Progressive between June 2024 and May 2025. Potential savings will vary.
To enjoy this episode of Forensic Tales ad-free, check us out on Patreon. Patreon.com/Forensic Tales.
Forensic Tales discusses topics that some listeners may find disturbing. The contents of this episode may not be suitable for everyone. Listener discretion is advised.
In the early 1970s, the quiet, tree-lined paths around Stanford University masked a terrifying secret. Two young women, bright, ambitious, and full of promise, were found murdered just a year apart. Their killer vanished without a trace, leaving behind heartbroken families and a community desperate for answers. For decades, the cases of Leslie Perlov and Janet Taylor went cold. Investigators had no suspects, no leads, and seemingly no way to find the person responsible. But what they did have, carefully collected and preserved, was forensic evidence. And nearly 50 years later, that evidence would do what no detective could. This is the story of how science caught a killer and a man who lived among us for decades, hiding in plain sight, until one tiny strand of DNA unraveled everything. This is Forensic Tales, episode number 293, The Murders of Leslie Perlov and Janet Taylor. Before we jump in, if you listened to last week's episode, you know we covered the murder of Arliss Perry, a cold case that also took place in Northern California during the 1970s. This week, we're staying in the same region and the same time period, but focusing on two different victims. While this isn't a two-part series, these stories share a similar atmosphere. A time when Stanford and its surrounding areas were grappling with a dark undercurrent, and answers were hard to come by. Leslie Perlov was just 21 years old when her life was tragically cut short. A recent Stanford graduate who worked at a law library in Palo Alto, California. Leslie had dreams of attending law school and becoming a lawyer someday. She was waiting to find out which law program she'd be accepted to when she was killed. One of the most common words used to describe her was smart. She always got straight A's in school, graduating high school in just 3 years. And her acceptance at Stanford for her undergrad, she had a full ride scholarship, something most college hopefuls her age only dream about. On top of being smart, she was also kind, driven, and full of potential. She had a bright future ahead of her, one that ended far too soon. A little over a year later, another young woman would meet a similar fate. Janet Taylor was also 21 years old. She was the daughter of Chuck Taylor, Stanford's former athletic director, and a very famous figure in the university's sports history. Janet was studying at Stanford and was known for her generous spirit and passion for helping others. She was the kind of person who made friends easily and wanted to use her life to make a difference, perhaps as a teacher or public servant. Both women had so much in common: smart, beautiful, driven, kind. Both were deeply connected to the Stanford community. They were daughters, friends, and students with their whole lives ahead of them. And both of their lives ended in eerily similar ways: strangled and left in remote areas just a few miles apart. Their murders sent shockwaves throughout this area of Northern California, and their families were left without answers for decades. Two promising women, two senseless murders, and no idea who was responsible. It was around 3 o'clock in the afternoon on February 13th, 1973, when Leslie called her mom saying that she was leaving work at the law library. It wasn't a far drive, so it shouldn't have taken her long to get home. Except she never made it. Something happened to her during that short drive home. When she didn't return home that evening, her friends and family grew concerned. She was never the type of person to just go off the grid. Within hours, her 1972 orange Chevrolet Nova was found abandoned at the end of a remote dirt road off Old Page Mill Road in the Santa Cruz Mountains near Stanford's campus. 3 days later, there was another discovery. On February 16th, a sheriff's office reserve mounted unit located Leslie's body under an oak tree in the hills, just west of where her car had been abandoned. She'd been strangled with her own silk scarf, which was still tied around her neck. And although she was fully clothed, detectives suspected she had also been sexually assaulted. As far as her murder goes, it was as brutal as it gets. On top of being strangled, Leslie's body bore telltale signs of what Santa Clara County Coroner Dr. Richard Mason described as prolonged, brutal torture. She had been beaten so badly that both of her eyes were swollen shut, her nose was broken, and her underwear and stockings had been stuffed down her throat. But when it came to the crime scene itself, it offered very little clues, and when no witnesses came forward, the case went cold within a matter of a few months. Just over a year later, Janet was murdered. On March 24th, 1974, Janet Taylor had spent the weekend visiting her family in the Bay Area. She was returning to campus, and like so many other students during this time, she decided to hitchhike. That decision would prove to be fatal. Later that same day, her body was found on Sand Hill Road, a wooded area just west of Stanford. Like Leslie, she'd been strangled, left partially naked, and possibly sexually assaulted. And from the jump, many people suspected that the police should be looking for the same suspect. The similarities between the two cases were just too similar to ignore. Both victims were young, 21-year-old Stanford women. They were both strangled and assaulted, and their bodies were dumped within just a few miles of one another. The only difference was the time of the crimes. Leslie was murdered about a year before. But despite the obvious parallels, no official connection was made at the time by the police. Different detectives were assigned to each investigation, and each one was handled very differently. And just like with Leslie's murder, Janet's case quickly went cold. Here's what Leslie's sister Diane had to say about the murder. Quote, "Leslie fought ferociously for her life. Leslie was stripped of her life and of her voice, but I am here." End quote. Her brother Craig described her bright potential. She just graduated from Stanford in 3 years, and she was set to go to law school. She was never able to be a lawyer for the underserved as she intended. never able to marry her fiancé, and to become the first female president of the United States, which she had planned since the 4th grade, end quote. In the immediate aftermath of both murders, local authorities launched an intensive investigation. The deaths of 2 young women, both connected to Stanford, rocked this normally quiet academic community. Detectives worked around the clock, but the truth is, they had little to go on. In Leslie's case, her body was found in a remote area under an oak tree. And while there were clear signs of sexual assault, forensic science in 1973 was nowhere near where it is today. There was no DNA testing, no advanced profiling techniques. So investigators collected trace evidence and photographed the scene, but none of that pointed toward any one suspect. And when it came to her car, it was found abandoned not far from her body. There were no fingerprints or eyewitnesses there either. Almost the exact same thing happened with Janet's case. No eyewitnesses, no DNA profiling capabilities, no fingerprints. And since neither of these cases were officially connected to the other, detectives working both investigations never shared any information. For over 4 decades, both cases remained unsolved, and both families were left with so many unanswered questions about what happened to these girls. But by 2017 and 2018, a renewed interest in cold cases, combined with dramatic advancements in forensic technology, breathed new life into both investigations. Santa Clara County and San Mateo County each had cold case units that had begun reviewing decades-old crimes with modern techniques. One of the most significant breakthroughs came from re-examining biological evidence collected at both crime scenes. In Leslie's case, investigators had preserved DNA evidence from her fingernail scrapings, and in Janet's case, there was also DNA. This time, they had access to something they didn't have in the 1970s, a national DNA database. But when those samples were entered into CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system, there weren't any hits. The person responsible had never been arrested for a qualifying offense that required him or her to submit a DNA submission. That's when investigators turned to something else. Something much better: forensic genetic genealogy. Working with experts and genealogists, investigators uploaded the unknown DNA profile to a public genealogy database, GEDmatch. This database allows people to share their DNA to find relatives as well as trace their ancestry. But now it's also being used to solve violent crimes. Crimes that occurred 30, 40, even 50 years ago. But genetic genealogy isn't without some criticism, especially when it comes to privacy concerns. Most of these DNA companies now inform their customers that their DNA can and sometimes will be accessed by law enforcement. So instead of just finding out about your ancestry, you might also learn you have a serial killer in your extended family. But you just can't deny how powerful this tool is. Forensic genetic genealogy is literally solving hundreds upon hundreds of old cold cases across the country and even across the world. Just because a suspect's DNA isn't in the national DNA database doesn't mean their DNA can't be traced to a relative. When it came to Leslie's case, investigators had DNA from an unknown male that had been found in her fingernail scrapings. So they compared that unknown DNA to distant relatives in the databases. From there, experts were able to build a family tree that eventually led to one man, John Arthur Getreu. He wasn't in the system, but his distant relatives were, and their DNA helped detectives zero in on him when it came to Leslie's murder. To confirm he was the guy, detectives needed to take one more step. Get John Getreu's DNA and do a direct DNA comparison. So that's when a few undercover police officers showed up at his current address and waited for the perfect opportunity to get something with his DNA on it. And within hours, they had something, a coffee cup. The cup was then sent to the lab for comparison, and a week later, they got the results. It was a match. Without a doubt, his DNA matched the DNA found underneath Leslie's fingernails at the time of her murder. So on November 20th, 2018, he was arrested outside his home in Hayward, California, for the murder of 21-year-old Leslie Perlov, a murder that happened nearly 4 decades earlier. But that's not nearly the end of this story. After his 2018 arrest for Leslie's murder, the dark past of John Getreu started to come to light. He was born in 1944, hundreds of miles away from Northern California in Ohio. He grew up one of 4 children to a father serving in the military, which meant the family moved around a lot. Throughout his childhood, Getreu and his family lived in multiple places in the U.S. and abroad, including Japan, Hawaii, and North Carolina. By 1960, his father had been transferred to West Germany to serve for several years. So all the kids packed up and moved there. And it was in West Germany that John's true murderous colors started to show. On the night of June 8th, 1963, shortly before graduation, the then 18-year-old Getreu attended a school dance where he met 15-year-old Margaret Williams, the daughter of a fellow serviceman. After the dance ended for the night, he took her to the campus's baseball field where he assaulted, raped, and beat her. The beating left her with a severe head injury that left her unable to survive. She died at the hospital sometime after the attack. It didn't take long for the police in West Germany to identify John as the suspect. Multiple witnesses saw the pair together that night, and he was almost immediately arrested for it. Now, initially, he completely denied even being with her that night. He said they must have identified the wrong person. But eventually, his story changed. He admitted to having sexual intercourse with her, but denied killing her. But none of that was convincing enough. It didn't convince the police, and it certainly didn't convince the court. In June of 1964, he was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to 10 years in prison, the maximum sentence available under West German law at the time. And at his sentencing hearing, he did something that many people found surprising. He expressed remorse for what he did and even apologized to the victim's family as well as his own family. After serving more than 6 years of his sentence, he was paroled and released. And right after that, he left Germany and returned to the United States, settling into Reno, Nevada. It was there he met and married a woman who's only been identified by her first name, Susan. After the wedding, the couple moved from Reno, Nevada to Palo Alto, California, and that's where his violent tendencies came roaring back to life. For the next 5 years, John and his wife lived in Palo Alto as a seemingly ordinary couple. They weren't necessarily living a financially comfortable life, but they were living a normal one. Because John never really learned any life or job skills, he was forced to work a number of odd jobs, like working as a security guard or working as a carpenter. And by the mid-1970s, he joined the Boy Scouts of America and got a job as a counselor. His job was to help the group organize camping trips. Now that we know a little bit more about him, working with children seems like one of the scariest jobs for this man to have. But that was one of the scariest things about him. He seemed to live under the radar. He was married with a wife at home. He worked for the Boy Scouts of America. He looked like an ordinary guy who could be your neighbor. No one knew about his previous murder and rape conviction back in West Germany. That criminal record didn't travel with him back to the United States. So he sort of became a killer hiding in plain sight. But by 1975, that was all about to change again. That year, he was arrested and charged for allegedly sexually abusing a 17-year-old female explorer scout. But before the case could go to trial, some of the criminal charges against him were dropped, but not all. But still, as a result of a plea agreement, John was only sentenced to prison for 6 months and received a fine. That was it. It was essentially a slap on the wrist. But the arrest had bigger consequences on his personal life. After the plea agreement, his wife Susan divorced him. Maybe she saw this as her opportunity to get away from a monster. However, less than a year later, he got remarried, this time to a woman only identified as Linda. Following the wedding, Linda and her now twice convicted rapist husband left California and moved to Ohio, where John grew up. It was there they had 2 children, and once again, he blended into society perfectly. No one in Ohio knew anything about his past, either in Germany or in Northern California. He once again became someone's neighbor, someone's friend. He showed no signs of violent behavior, no signs of mental illness, nothing. He was just the guy next door, a husband and now a father of 2 children. But Ohio wasn't their forever home. By the 1980s, the family returned back to Northern California, this time settling into Alameda County. For the next 2 decades, the family continued living an ordinary life. By 2003, there was a death in the family. Linda had been diagnosed with a terminal form of cancer and died later that year. But if you thought his love life was over, you'd be wrong. 5 years later, in 2008, he was married for a 3rd time. This was now the 3rd woman in his life who knew nothing about his past. They didn't know who this person was. Right after his arrest in 2018 for Leslie's murder, detectives wondered if there could be more victims out there. They now had his DNA, so all they had to do was compare it against other unsolved cases in the area. And that's when they decided to compare it to Janet Taylor's case. Her case was right up there as being one of the area's oldest cold cases. And given the similarities between hers and Leslie's case, they couldn't deny the possibility that maybe John might actually be a serial killer. And they were right. On May 16th, 2019, after the completion of additional DNA testing, he was charged with Janet's March 24th, 1974 murder, a full 45 years later. His DNA matched the DNA collected at her crime scene. It was also a match to Leslie's case. The man who lived near Stanford was a husband, was a father, is now at least a 3-time serial murderer and rapist, all while hiding in plain sight. Almost immediately, the authorities in NorCal wondered if there could still be more victims. They started looking at more unsolved murders and rapes in the Stanford area, looking for any clues that might connect this man to other cases, other young women victims. If this man is capable of killing at least 3 women, who's to say there aren't even more victims out there who still need justice? In the months and years that followed, several women came forward saying that they might be one of his victims, or they knew someone who might have been. The first was a woman named Sharon. While reading an online article about his arrest, Sharon says she recognized his mugshot on the screen staring back at her. "I was looking for 50 years for that face," she said to Journal Star. Although he had aged a lot over the years and the decades, she said she recognized his eyes. According to Sharon, she was 19 years old when she was attacked and almost killed by him. Fortunately, though, she was able to get away and survive what happened to her. Otherwise, she could have easily become victim number 4. Then in February 2022, there were more accusations. Journalist Grace Gong alleged that she and several investigators identified John as the possible killer of 15-year-old Teresa Smith, who was murdered in her home in Newark, Ohio in 1980. But as of today, no criminal charges have ever been filed in that case. Teresa Smith's 1980 murder still remains unsolved. In 2021, John Getreu went to trial for the murder of Janet Taylor. The trial was held in San Mateo County in California and lasted about 3 weeks. Prosecutors presented the jury with clear forensic evidence. The preserved DNA from Janet's body matched John through genealogical investigation, and it was later confirmed with a direct sample. But the prosecution also leaned on his criminal history, specifically the rape and murder conviction in Germany. The similarities between the two cases were hard to ignore. A young female victim, strangled, sexually assaulted, left in a remote location. This was this guy's MO. But the defense attempted to challenge the DNA evidence, suggesting that it was mishandled, and they argued that John's advanced age and his deteriorating health made the charges unjust. But the jury wasn't swayed. On September 15th, he was found guilty on all charges and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The DNA evidence was enough to say beyond any reasonable doubt that this guy killed Janet all these years before. After that, it was time for Leslie's family to get their justice. Immediately following his conviction in San Mateo County, he was transferred to Santa Clara County to stand trial for first-degree murder there. But the trial was initially delayed after John's defense argued that because of his declining health, he wasn't fit enough to stand trial. So it was temporarily suspended until the end of 2022. But by this point, the judge forced the case to move forward even while John was still in the hospital. He attended his court proceedings via Zoom from his hospital bed. But confronted with the DNA evidence in the case, he decided to not take his case to trial. He pled guilty to Leslie's murder on January 10th, 2023. He said he felt compelled to kill her after she resisted his attempts to rape her. For that guilty plea, he received a second life sentence to be served consecutive to the first one. But at this point, his days behind bars were numbered. Only about 9 months later, he died in prison due to his health complications in September of 2023 at the age of 79. That means he only spent a few years in prison for the rapes and murders he committed over 4 decades earlier. He spent the majority of his life a total free man. During the sentencing hearings, the courtroom was filled with emotion. Family members of both Leslie and Janet addressed John directly, sharing their pain, their loss, and the years they'd spent waiting for justice. Leslie's sister, Diane, spoke forcefully. "Feel our strength and feel our fury." Her brother, Craig, reminded the court of who Leslie was, her dreams of law school, her deep compassion, and her childhood goal of becoming the first female president. After nearly 5 decades, their words finally had a courtroom to echo in. The cases of Leslie Perlov and Janet Taylor are perfect examples of how far forensic science has come and how those advancements are helping to solve cold cases once thought unsolvable. In the 1970s, DNA analysis didn't exist. Crime scene evidence was limited to what investigators could see, collect, and examine underneath a microscope. But thanks to the foresight of investigators who preserved biological evidence from both cases, there was still a chance for justice, even almost 5 decades later. The key to both cases was forensic genetic genealogy, a relatively new investigative tool that's completely revolutionized how detectives solve violent crimes. Rather than relying on direct DNA matches in CODIS, genealogical research builds out a family tree based on distant relatives found in public databases like GEDmatch. In these cases, the DNA profile from the crime scenes didn't match anyone in CODIS, but once uploaded to GEDmatch, partial matches to distant cousins led investigators to the suspect. From there, it became a matter of narrowing the family tree, confirming timelines, and obtaining a direct DNA sample. And it worked. This method gained national attention in the case of the Golden State Killer, and since then, it's helped close hundreds of cold cases all across the country. But it also raises questions about privacy and ethics. Some people worry about law enforcement using public genealogy databases without consent. Others see it as a necessary tool in the pursuit of justice. In the end, this case shows what's possible when science, persistence, and technology come together. It also underscores the importance of preserving evidence, even when a case feels hopeless, because decades later, that evidence may be the very thing that finally brings a killer to justice. But now that our prime suspect is dead, the story still might not be over. Law enforcement still believes there could be more victims. His violent history began with a murder in Germany in the 1960s and continued with 2 brutal murders in the 1970s. Yet for decades, he lived quietly in California. So investigators continue to review other unsolved murders from the region around that time period, looking for similar patterns. So far, no additional charges have been filed, but the investigation remains open. For the families of Leslie and Janet, the road to justice was long and agonizing. Nearly 50 years passed between the crimes and the convictions. But in the end, science delivered the answers they had waited a lifetime for. Today, both women are remembered not just for how they died, but for how they lived. Bright, compassionate, driven. Thanks to the persistence of cold case detectives and the power of modern forensics, their voices were finally heard, and their killer was finally named. To share your thoughts on this week's episode, follow us on Instagram and Facebook. If you want to hear my personal take on the case, sign up to become a patron at patreon.com/forensictales. After each episode, I release a bonus episode where I share my personal thoughts on the case. Don't forget to subscribe to Forensic Tales so you never miss an episode. We release a new episode every Monday. If you love the show, please consider leaving us a positive review. It helps the show grow. You can also support the show through Patreon. Thank you for joining me this week. Be sure to tune in next week for a new case. Until then, remember, not all stories have happy endings. Forensic Tales is a Rockefeller audio production. The show is written and produced by me, Courtney Fretwell. If you'd like to help create compelling new cases, fund research, and assist with production and editing costs, you can support the show with a small monthly contribution. In return, you'll be one of the first to listen to new ad-free episodes and gain access to exclusive content. To learn more, visit patreon.com/Forensic Tales. Forensic Tales is a podcast made possible by our Patreon producers: Tony A., Christine B., Sherry A., Michael D., Nicola, Megan G., Ureli, Jerry, Ann F., Carol A., Shannon D., Marianne C., Lois B., Lynn H., Ashley H., Danielle D., Chrissy D., Brett R., Luz Raquel, and Christine K. If you'd like to become a producer of the show, head over to our Patreon page or email me at courtney@forensictales.com. For a complete list of sources used in this episode, please visit forensictales.com. Thank you for listening. I'll see you next week. Until then, remember, not all stories have happy endings.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever think about switching insurance companies to see if you could save some cash? Progressive makes it easy. Just drop in some details about yourself and see if you're eligible to save money when you bundle your home and auto policies. The process only takes minutes, and it could mean hundreds more in your pocket. Visit Progressive.com after this episode to see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary. Not available in all states.